Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for being here today. My name is Kim Bowling, and I'll tell you a little bit about myself. I'm a mostly neurotypical, white, heterosexual, cisgender female. I've been married for 31 years to a wonderful man, and my husband and I have 2 young adult children together. They're both grown and flown, and I miss them. I am a licensed psychologist in private practice and an assistant trainer with IFSI. And I also have a certification in neurodiverse couples counseling from the Peter M. Freeman Neurodiverse Couples Institute, which is part of the Asperger Autism Network of New England. Today, Amanda Connell is our host, and she's going to be helping us organize the Q&A. So we'll take a few 10-minute breaks during the, hi Amanda. We'll take a few 10-minute breaks for questions and comments during the presentation. And if you have questions that don't get answered today, please feel free to email me afterwards, and I will get back to them as quickly as I can. So I'm going to share my screen now. And hopefully I'll do it correctly. There we go. Okay. So I'm sure you're familiar with IFS, but you may not know the acronym IFIO. That stands for Intimacy from the Inside Out, and that is the couples modality developed by Tony Herbine Blank based on IFS. So here's our agenda for today. We're going to be focusing in particular on couples in which one partner is autistic or has characteristics of autism. That's not the only form of neurodiversity, but it is a common one. And as you can see on the agenda, we'll start with that concept of neurodiversity, which I believe is foundational to doing effective work with neurodivergent clients, both individuals and couples. Then we'll look at some of the common challenges that mixed neurotype couples face. We'll do some work with our own parts. And finally, we'll put it all together and see how we can help mixed neurotype couples using IFS and IFIO. But first, we're going to watch a short clip of a popular television show. You might want to have something to write with nearby because I'm going to ask you to track your parts as you watch. So let me tell you a little bit about this clip. This is from a television show called The Good Doctor. The main character of the show is Sean, and he is an autistic man, and he is a resident in surgery. And also in the clip is Carly. She also works at the hospital as a pathologist, and she is Sean's girlfriend. So here are some things I'm going to ask you to pay attention to as you watch this clip. First and foremost, what parts come up for you as you're watching? And you might want to jot those down if there are many. And we're not going to process them right now, but we will come back to them later. And then secondly, do you find yourself siding with one partner over the other or judging one of them in some way? So pay attention to those two things, what parts come up for you and how you're feeling toward each of the partners in the clip. So I think I need to unshare my screen here. And then I need to bear with me a moment while I get the video up.
Are you going to take my hand?
You're just still muted, Kim.
Thank you. So I'll give you a minute or two to jot down any notes that you might want to take. And as I said, we're not going to look at them now, but we'll process some things later. Okay, so it's hard to gauge how long to pause because I can't see anybody, but I'm going to move on here. So let's talk about neurodiversity. What is neurodiversity? So neurodiversity describes the naturally occurring diversity of human brains. Between 30 and 40% of the population are thought to have a noticeable neurodivergency. The term was coined by Australian sociologist Judy Singer in the late 90s. And it's often associated with autism, but it does include any form of neurological variation like dyslexia, ADHD, epilepsy, and many others. The Neurodiversity Movement is a social justice movement that seeks civil rights, equality, respect, and full societal inclusion for the neurodivergent population. The Neurodiversity Paradigm recognizes neurodiversity as being subject to the same processes as other forms of diversity, including power and oppression. So all told, neurodiversity is a viewpoint that brain differences are not deficits or pathologies, and they don't need to be cured or eradicated. An individual should not have to be normal, quote unquote, in order to enjoy the full range of human experience. So just as we have ramps and elevators in buildings for physical disabilities, appropriate supports should be in place for those who have different needs based on neurology. And if you want to know more about neurodiversity, there's more about that in the handouts and in the resources. And yeah, so you'll see that in the resources, which is the resources are listed also in the handouts. So and you can also, of course, email me. I love this quote by Dr. Nick Walker. I think it really says it all. Dr. Walker is a professor of psychology at the California Institute of Integral Studies. Here's the quote. The idea that there is one normal or healthy type of brain or mind, or one right style of neurocognitive functioning is no more valid than the idea that there is one normal or right gender, race, or culture. So here's some common terminology that we use. As I've said, neurodiverse refers to the natural diversity of human brains. Groups of two or more people we can refer to as neurodiverse, but we don't refer to individuals that way. And part of me wonders if that'll change as we understand more about parts and neurology, if we can refer to one person's system as neurodiverse. But for now, we don't do that. Instead, for an individual, for one person, we refer to them as neurodivergent. So an individual is neurodivergent, a group of two or more is neurodiverse. And if someone has neurology that aligns with the majority, we refer to them as neurotypical or sometimes just NT. Autism spectrum disorder, also called ASD for short, is a diverse group of conditions characterized by some degree of difficulty with social interaction and communication. And it's important to note that autism is not one unified construct. It's a diverse group of conditions that are not well understood. Other characteristics are atypical patterns of activities and behaviors, such as difficulty with transitions from one activity to another, a focus on details, and unusual reactions to sensations. This is from the World Health Organization. We used to use functioning terms, high functioning and low functioning, but we're trying not to use those anymore. They're very problematic for several reasons. First of all, they were based on IQ, and as I'm sure most of you know, IQ and functioning are not the same thing. They don't always even correlate very well. This terminology is stigmatizing. It incorrectly simplifies autism into a one-dimensional construct, more or less. And unfortunately, these terms have been used to exclude people from services or opportunities. So someone who was considered high functioning might not get the right supports that they need, or someone who was considered low functioning might be excluded from educational or job opportunities. So we're not using those terms anymore. It's much more nuanced and complicated than that, really. And I will say also that most autistic people prefer not to use person-first terminology. Most will prefer to say, I'm an autistic person rather than a person with autism. And there are a few reasons for that. It's again, stigmatizing. It's identifying the person as other than normal by highlighting that. In English, we put the adjectives before the nouns. So I wouldn't say I'm a person with femaleness. So hence an autistic person, but obviously you're going to honor the preference of your clients and your friends if they have a different opinion about that. Here are some concepts that I need to share with you for the presentation. We're going to be talking about these a bit. So alexithymia is not a disorder, but rather it is a broad term to describe difficulty articulating one's feelings. So alexithymia can be caused by many different things. One might be difficulty with self-perception or interoception, a difficulty perceiving one's own internal states, but it also might be caused by a difficulty naming one's internal states. In other words, someone may full well be able to feel their different states and understand them and understand what they mean, but have trouble articulating that in a way that other people can understand. Alexithymia is thought to affect about 10% of the general population and anywhere from 50 to 85% of the autistic population. So if you work with this population, you're likely to run into it. So let's talk about a biggie here, empathy. So there is a damaging myth that autistic folks lack empathy or the capacity for it. This is simply not true. And the myth is born out of neurotypical bias, and it contributes to dehumanization and marginalization. Empathy is a complex concept, and one way we can break it down is by distinguishing what we call affective empathy from cognitive empathy. Affective empathy is the ability to feel the feels. We can all do that. Cognitive empathy might be characterized by something like, I get why you would feel that way. It's a cognitive understanding of where someone else is coming from. So affective empathy, sometimes called emotional empathy, is just as prevalent and accessible in autistic individuals as it is in neurotypical ones. And in fact, autistic individuals may have fewer ways of protecting themselves from experiencing affective empathy. And from an IFS lens, we can even imagine parts having to form to block out some of that input in order to protect the individual from being overwhelmed by intense emotion. On the other hand, cognitive empathy is something that everyone struggles with at times, regardless of neurology. Challenges with cognitive empathy can be due to parts, to neurology, or to simply a lack of experience. But fortunately, cognitive empathy is something that we can help our clients cultivate. So now let's hear directly from some autistic people about their own experiences. And Alexandra, you'll let me know if there's any tech problems with this. I'm a little worried that these might not play properly.
Absolutely.
Great, thank you so much. So first up is Z, and I'll let you hear from her.
I've got this like half-baked thought where I loved horror movies so much, still do, especially ones featuring like creepy children, because those creepy children were actually just children displaying autistic traits, and I could relate to them.
So I'm curious how that landed on folks. I know we can't really interact live here very well, but I'm struck in that clip by, you know, sort of the matter of factness of using autistic children or qualities of autistic as, you know, creepy children or zombies or something like that. I think that really speaks to the dehumanization that occurs. So next up is Lena, and she does talk pretty quickly. So hopefully you can read the captioning that she has, but she summarizes a lot of the concepts that we've discussed. And again, a lot of what she's saying you'll be able to see in the handouts too if you have trouble following.
There are some misconceptions about autism that I didn't know were false until I did my initial research, and I wanted to address them here. I thought Asperger's was a less severe form of autism and that people with Asperger's were more functional than autistic people. So this is not true. Asperger's is no longer a diagnosis, it's just autism. And lots of autistic people don't like to use Asperger's as a self-identifier anymore. I thought functioning labels were used to describe how autistic a person is, as in higher functioning means belonging to the less autistic end of the spectrum. There are many problematic things with what I just said. First of all, functioning labels are harmful because it implies effectiveness. And second of all, the autism spectrum is not linear, as if one end of the spectrum is neurotypical and the other end is very autistic. It actually looks like a circle where it's a collection of traits and each autistic person can exhibit more or less of each trait. And depending on your collection of traits, this can impact your support needs. And your support needs can vary even from day to day.
Okay. So bringing in IFS, as I'm sure you know already, IFS is humanistic, it's insight-oriented, it's experiential, it's systems-based, and it fosters secure internal attachment, self-to-parts. So in contrast to this, existing therapies for autistic individuals or mixed neurology couples is largely behavioral and problem-solving in nature, and it tends to make autistic individuals to try to make them behave more like neurotypicals. So there are several problems with that, in my opinion. So this kind of approach, a behavioral and problem-solving approach, can further marginalize the autistic person. It underestimates an autistic person and assumes that they're not capable of introspection, and therefore it denies them the benefits of insight-oriented work. And in couples, in working with mixed neurology couples, the behavioral and problem-solving only approach can contribute to a parent-child dynamic by over-relying on the neurotypical partner to do all the work, and again, underestimating and marginalizing the autistic person. The behavioral and problem-solving approach also avoids the most common presenting issue in mixed neurology couples, which is emotional disconnection. It really doesn't address that at all. It's a glaring omission. And so when we bring in IFS and combine it with the neurodiversity, we get respect for all clients as their own experts. It flattens the hierarchy. It's not my place to tell you how you should behave or how you should solve your problems. You know better than I do. It trusts that everyone has access to self and is capable of insight regardless of neurotype. And many people with autism have very deep bone bruises and burdens around being weird or broken or unlovable or always wrong. They get these messages from a very early age. You don't get it. What's wrong with you? So IFS helps them release those burdens and heal. Okay, so I'm going to pause now and maybe spend about 10 minutes on questions and answers. And Amanda's going to help us moderate those. I think if you put them in the Q&A, maybe I'll stop the share for a minute. I think if you put them in the Q&A, that will be the place to go, right? Okay. Anything so far?
Yeah, so we have one question from Molly. I'm looking for clarity regarding the neurodiversity term and movement. Did you say that issues other than autism spectrum tend not to be included in the advocacy? I had not heard this. I identify as 2E with ADHD, living in a challenging family ecosystem of 2E people. I'm sorry if I'm not saying 2E properly. I'm not familiar with the term. Mostly asking for clarity. Did I hear you correctly? Also, who's doing the defining? Is it more of a trend or is there an
I just lost my feed.
identifying?
The last part I was breaking up, Amanda, but I think I got the gist of the question. So no, I did not mean to imply that the neurodiversity movement is specific to autism. The term is often thought of as autism, but it really does include all forms of neurodiversity, whether ADHD, dyslexia, et cetera, et cetera. And who's defining that? There's not one sort of leader of the movement. It's a global movement, and there are a lot of players in it. But if you look, and again, my familiarity with it comes from the autism perspective, more than a more broad approach. But if you look it up, I'm taking those definitions just from sort of common descriptions. It's basically a movement to de-pathologize any form of neurodiversity. Does that answer the question? I cannot hear you. Amanda, I can't hear for some reason.
That was my bad. I was muted. Just saying, Molly, you can just enter into the chat if you feel satisfied with Kim's response, and I'm going to take a look to see. Oh, she says yes. Great.
Oh, great. Okay.
So the next question I have here is from Gail. I hope you address the common experience of one person experiencing frustration about attributes and behavior that were clearly present from the start. That strikes me as a nuanced, important issue to work with. I'm thinking this is in regard to the video.
Can you read it again? Amanda, do you mind reading it again?
I hope you address the common experience of one person experiencing frustration about attributes and behavior that were clearly present from the start. That strikes me as a nuanced, important issue to work with.
So I will be talking about the experiences of both partners in a mixed neurotype relationship. And so so that question was from Gail. So Gail, if I don't address it in the next sections of the presentation, please repost your comment, okay?
There are folks who are expressing a desire to share the circle chart.
Yes, that's actually in the handouts. So so there's a comic in the there's a comic in the handouts. That particular circle chart came from The Mighty, I think, but it's just one example. It's not like sort of a formal thing, but there's maybe a better example of that in the handouts. There's a comic by Rebecca Burgess that talks about the one dimension versus the multi-dimension, and there's a graphic of it in there that you'll be able to see.
Great. And then another question here. More of a comment. As a mother of 2 autistic boys, I'd love to hear about the grief you find, perhaps in relation to the disconnect. And that's from Jill.
Yeah, so Jill, we're not going to be talking today about parents and children at all. That's, a very large topic, obviously. I'm really focusing on couples, and I will be talking about the frustrations and the challenges that couples face, but unrelated to the children in the relationship. Obviously, that's hugely important. I just didn't have time today to address that at all.
Thank you. Do you want one more, or do you want to move on?
We can take one more, I think.
So from Charlene, are there any difficulties you see with someone who is neurodivergent learning the IFS process or understanding some of the subjective and sensing inside, capital letters, skills? Sorry if my terminology is wrong. I'm still learning.
Yeah, that's a great question. So yes, I think that the process can take longer, and we may need to help the person addressing challenges, let's say, of alexithymia. And also, we use a lot of direct access, and these are things that I'll repeat later in the presentation too, but a great question. Yeah, the answer is yes. It looks a little different. It's not impossible. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Okay, so let me share my screen again. Okay. Okay, so now we're going to look at some of the common relationship challenges that couples face when they're in mixed neurotype relationships. Excuse me. So if you work with mixed neurotype couples, the presenting problem, the reason they're going to come into your office most of the time is because of chronic misattunement and emotional disconnection. That's what's going to bring them in most likely. And so on the left side of this slide, there's something that we call in this community the Cassandra phenomenon, and it refers to a neurotypical partner in a mixed neurology relationship who feels that the relationship has been detrimental to their mental health or self-esteem. The term comes from mythology and refers to Cassandra, who was given the gift of telling the truth but was never believed. And many neurotypical folks in neurodiverse relationships experience that, both with their partners, but also with professionals and friends. And so one of my clients referred to this as death by 1,000 cuts. Any one thing might not seem like a big deal, but it's the cumulative and persistent and deep repetition of that misattunement and emotional disconnect that is so painful over time. And in fact, Maxine Aston, who's authored a couple of books on this, has coined the term affect deprivation disorder. I don't know if you've seen the still face baby videos. They're quite painful to watch. So if you haven't seen them, I don't necessarily recommend watching them. But if you have seen them, it can feel a little bit like that to a neurotypical partner. If an autistic partner has a very flat affect, whether or not they're feeling things inside, they may present with a flat affect. And for the neurotypical partner, that can feel, extremely extremely upsetting and dysregulating, and especially as it accumulates over time. So let's say that we have, a heterosexual couple, and let's say that the husband is on the spectrum and the wife is not. And let's say that the wife is telling a friend something like, my husband, when he goes on business trips, he doesn't communicate with me at all. It's just like I don't even exist. Or when he's at work, he doesn't call me. And you can imagine a friend saying, oh, come on, what's the big deal? That happens to me too. Your husband's probably just focused on work. It's not like he's having an affair or anything. And so that's an example kind of the Cassandra phenomenon. A neurotypical person might, minimize or dismiss the concern and really not get the profound suffering that's happening. So as therapists and clinicians, that's what you really want to listen for and even probably anticipate. On the right-hand side of the graphic, if we think about an autistic person or someone with an autistic profile, any group that's marginalized has the experience of not being understood by the group in power. Typically, the marginalized and oppressed groups, they have to understand the groups in power in order to function in society safely, but the groups in power don't have to understand the marginalized groups in order to function in safety. And so when we get some of this comparative suffering, oh, I know what you mean, oh, I have that too, it's extremely damaging and hurtful. So in this quote, I imagine an autistic person saying to a friend, I really just can't do social situations. I feel awkward. It's hard for me. I get overwhelmed. I don't know what people are meaning or whatever they might say. And the friend saying, oh, come on, I feel awkward in social situations too. Everybody does. I know what you mean. Just get over it. So this is such a common experience for neurodivergent folks, that they may have parts that have given up trying to explain themselves, or they may question themselves on everything they do, and they've likely acquired burdens of being wrong or bad. In therapy, you may see a neurodivergent partner taking all the blame onto themselves, or even both partners assigning blame to the neurodivergent partner. That's a way in which an exile that has a burden of I'm bad, I am wrong, a way that it might show up, everything is my fault. And there may be a shared expectation between the couple that everything should be done the way that the neurotypical partner wants it done. And that's an expression, obviously, of neurotypical bias. So something that you want to be watching out for in these relationships, they can be subject to abuse in either direction, the neurotypical partner to the autistic partner or vice versa. So you'll really want to listen for that and screen for that. And you would approach it in the same way that you'd approach that issue in a neurotypical couple, whatever your policies and procedures are around that, whether it be connecting them with more supports or not working with them, or however you handle that. Okay. So here are some domains in which there are often problems with mixed neurotype couples, and we might call them neurological divides. There's some overlap in these domains. I want to say also that presenting issues sometimes look on the surface the same as they do in neurotypical couples, but the underlying mechanisms and the underlying parts that are at play may be different. So here's a little bit of a look under the hood of what can happen. So in communication, there's often a difference between, and this is actually true for everybody, there's a difference in terms of how direct or indirect people are in the way that they communicate. So there's a difference between implying something versus stating it outright. And so a very simple, benign example of that might be if I say to my partner, hey, are you going to stop at the store on the way home from work? I'm asking a yes/no question. I'm not asking, will you do me a favor? I'm asking a yes/no question, and I might get a yes/no answer. If, for a neurodivergent partner, sorry, I'm stumbling over my words here. Are you going to stop at the store on the way back from work? In a straightforward interpretation of that, it's a yes/no answer. However, a neurotypical person, knowing social rules and having assumptions around kind of common interactions, might get frustrated at that answer, as you can imagine. So knowledge of social rules and social norms does also play a part in the direct versus indirect communication issue. So as a neurotypical person, I might know that if you're in a group of people and something potentially embarrassing is happening to one of them, they have spinach in their teeth, I'm not going to give them feedback in front of the group. I'm going to maybe say, hey, come on over here for a minute, and I'll tell them off to the side. But a person on the spectrum might not have that judgment that this is going to embarrass them, or this is something bad or something to be ashamed of, and they might just say it in the group. And so it's the knowledge of the common social rules that's causing that disconnect and the assumptions that are being made. And as you can imagine, that might cause a fight in a couple later that night. And then also use of literary devices like metaphor or sarcasm. In sarcasm, we're pretty much saying the opposite of what we believe, right? And so that's very indirect. And so oftentimes a neurotypical person will make more use of those indirect methods of communicating, whereas the autistic person will be more direct. Pragmatics of communication refers to the practical use of words, not just communication of content, but the other reasons that we use language. So for example, small talk is a good example of a different kind of pragmatic. When we're making small talk, we're doing a little bit of a dance with people we don't necessarily know well, or we're filling time, but it doesn't matter really what the content is. Nobody cares about the weather. We all know if it's raining or sunny, and we all have our preferences, right? But it's the function of the language that we're using, not the content. Another example of that might be making a bid for connection. So maybe I say to my partner, hey, you, and I'm just trying to interact with them or get a reaction. Again, it doesn't really matter what the content is. So I'm using language in a different way there also. And so across this neurological divide, neurotypical people and autistic people very often have different pragmatics or assumptions about pragmatics in the way that they use language. And then finally, nonverbals. So there's sort of a cousin of autism called nonverbal learning disability or nonverbal learning disorder. And folks with that diagnosis really can't read body language. And sometimes autistic people have trouble with that too. But sometimes people on the spectrum can read body language perfectly well, but they may not be attending to it as often as a neurotypical person does. So even for a neurotypical person, if I'm looking down at my phone and my partner rolls their eyes, if I was looking at them, I would notice it and know what it meant. But if I'm looking at my phone, I just miss it. So nonverbals are also an issue in communication. There are many more things that I could have included in here, but it's just too much to cover right now. But I'm sure you can imagine some things, and if you have questions about that, I can address those. So the next domain is focus. So there's a pretty famous test that was done. It's called the selective attention test. There's a video of it, and it's really kind of makes me laugh. There's a group of people, and they're bouncing a ball between them. There's maybe, let's say, like 8 people or 10 people. Half of them are wearing white shirts, half of them are wearing black shirts. And the person that's watching the video is asked to count the number of times the people with white shirt bounce the ball to each other. So they've got a pretty specific instruction there about where the researcher is wanting them to pay attention, giving them some pretty specific directions. So in the middle of the task, a person dressed in a gorilla suit walks into the middle of the ball game and kind of does this and turns around and then leaves. And what's fascinating is that about 50% of people fail to notice the gorilla. 50% of people notice it, 50% of people fail to notice it. Now, when that test was done, to the best of my knowledge, I don't know if there have been updates to it, but it wasn't broken up into neurology. This is 50% of a cross-section of people fail to notice the gorilla. And I think that that's a really good example of focused attention. If I'm concentrating so much on the task at hand of counting the times that the ball bounced, I'm really not attending to anything else, even something that other people consider fairly obvious. So that's what I mean by object of attention. What are we really paying attention to, and how much are we concentrating on that? That's going to limit what we notice otherwise. And again, neurotypical people and autistic people tend to vary in this way in what they're paying attention to. I like to think of, I use a metaphor in my mind of a camera in terms of understanding in a non-pathologizing way the differences between autistic neurology and neurotypical neurology. So if you think about looking at Google Maps on your phone or on your computer, you can zoom in and out, right? And so if you're zoomed out, you can, let's say that you're going to travel halfway around the world in an airplane, and you want to see, what countries are in between, you want to see what bodies of water you're going over. You need to zoom out to see all of that, right? But if you're going to be driving in a city somewhere and you need to look at the streets, you've got to zoom way in. So we need all Zoom levels. One is not inherently better than the other. We need them all at different times and in different circumstances. And there's a trade-off in detail versus perspective. When we're zoomed in, we have a lot of detail. When we're zoomed out, we have a lot of perspective. So it seems to me, this is just my theory, that many autistic people prefer to be at a deeper Zoom level, and many neurotypical people can be a little bit more zoomed out. So that's just an idea I have. There's no research around that at all. I kind of made that up, but that's my impression. The other thing that I like to think about is if you think about a camera focusing on different things, I'm old enough to remember when autofocus, was a new thing or something like that. And so I feel that many neurotypical people have somewhat of an autofocus lens. If I'm trying to follow something and it's just not making sense, I might kind of check, am I focusing on the right thing? Am I too zoomed in or too zoomed out? And I can adjust that pretty well. I might not always get it right, but it's pretty good. On the other hand, photographers, and before autofocus was a thing, have separate and manual lenses for their cameras, and they're very accurate and they're very high end and very pristine, but they're manual, so they're clunky, and so changing them is time consuming. There's a lot of overhead and effort involved in changing the zoom level and the focus level. So again, we have trade-offs. If we have manual lenses, we might have more precision. We might have a really spectacular telephoto lens that can go very close and get incredible detail, but we lose the flexibility. Whereas with autofocus, we have the flexibility, but we lose precision a little bit. So that's my camera metaphor. And I do use that sometimes to explain things to couples, because again, I think it's a non-pathologizing way to look at some differences in neurology. And so then the final thing in focus is attention to process versus content. So neurotypical people, not always, but sometimes attend to a process. They're more likely to attend to interpersonal information or verbs, movement, and liquidity. Whereas autistic people in general tend to focus more on content, the nouns, the details, the tangibles. And so this can be another area of disconnect between partners in a mixed neurotype relationship. Perspective taking is the big one, right? This is the thing that people always talk about. It's just one component, but it is a big one. So I'm going to show you this slide and introduce you to this concept, if you don't know about it already, called double empathy. The double empathy problem argues that autistic and non-autistic people have different social communication styles, with each group having difficulty empathizing with the other. So there was a recent test that was presented at a conference. I don't think it's written up in a paper yet, but it was trying to determine if social cognition is truly impaired in autistic individuals compared with neurotypical individuals. And so what they did was they set up 3 groups of people. They had a group of just autistic people, they had a group of just neurotypical people, and then they had a mixed group, 50-50 neurotypical and autistic. And within each of those groups, they played a game of telephone, that game where you kind of whisper something into the next person's ear and it goes around the circle. So as you might expect, the mixed group, the group that had both autistic and neurotypical people in it, lost details at a tremendously fast rate. They did not do well. However, the 2 homogeneous groups, the entirely autistic group and the entirely neurotypical group, lost detail at a much slower rate. Each group did really pretty well, especially compared with the mixed group. And interestingly, they did just about as well as each other. So within the one neurological category, they were able to understand each other pretty well. But when you mix them, we got this problem. So Mitchell, Shepard, and Cassidy, as well as others, talk about this double empathy problem. We often hear that autistic people have impaired theory of mind, and there might be that might be true. I'm not going to speak to that because that's a whole big thing in and of itself. But we might say my autistic partner doesn't get me; they don't understand me. Well, I also probably don't get my autistic partner, and so it's a two-way issue. So the double empathy problem is one of the areas of perspective that shows up. Preferences can also play into perspective. If someone's interest is low or high in something, if my interest is high or low in, let's say, baseball, I'm more or less motivated to listen to your experience of it and to take in your perspective. So, if my partner everything I say about my partner here, by the way, is hypothetical. I'm not literally saying me, I just speak that way to kind of personalize it and make it real. But let's say that I don't care about baseball, but my partner does. And my partner is really worked up about who got traded or who's retired or who's injured and, the playoffs and blah, blah, blah. If I really don't care, it's going to be a lot more effortful for me to really attend to that and sort of ride the wave of my partner's experience. And then assumptions also play a big role in perspective taking. In general, I find that autistic individuals make fewer assumptions, which is kind of clean, actually, and beautiful. And it's not that they're unable to, it's that it feels presumptuous and possibly dangerous. The chances are very high that an autistic person has been burned and criticized and shamed for making incorrect assumptions. So they're much less likely to do it. And also there's a fair-mindedness where it just feels presumptuous to make an assumption about anything. So let's say that I have a friend who's been looking for a job for months and they finally got an interview. They got one interview, but then they didn't get the position. So as a neurotypical, I might think, oh, they're probably going to be disappointed and upset. Maybe I should reach out and offer them some support, ask how they're doing. But an autistic person with a friend in the same situation might not make those assumptions. The autistic person might realize maybe my friend is happy that they didn't get the job because it would have made them move away or do work that they didn't want to do. So again, you'll see this difference in assumptions, both social assumptions, but also just assumptions in general about situations where the neurotypical people have sort of a common set of assumptions they're making, and the autistic people have a different common set of assumptions or not assumptions that they're making, and they don't like each other very much. The assumption mismatch there. Okay. So sensory needs. So this is not well understood, but for whatever reason, autistic individuals can have sensory processing challenges. And in particular, they can have trouble filtering out some sensory information or sorting it into foreground and background. Not everybody, not with every sense. Certainly neurotypical people have this too, but it's pretty prevalent in the autistic population. And so, for example, you're probably listening to my voice right now, but if you have a fan going on in the background, or if you have a dog barking, you may be able to kind of relegate that to the background and still attend to my voice. But this kind of foreground and background thing, if you have trouble doing that, you hear all the sounds at once and they're equally as, prominent, and it's hard to distinguish and filter out, and that can be very overwhelming. Too much of this or a high sensitivity to sensory information, even if it's not a distinguishing issue, there can also be like a visceral and a very strong sensitivity to sensory information in autistic individuals. And that can lead to overstimulation and meltdowns, as well as a need for recovery time afterwards. If you've been overstimulated, you need to recover. So this difference in sensory needs can affect intimacy and affection. So I think that in the YouTube clip we showed earlier of Sean and Carly that showed up, it seemed like Sean had some sensory issues with the hand holding. It wasn't comfortable for him for some reason. That you can imagine that also affecting intimacy and lots of ways that it can affect affection in couples. It can also affect shared activities. I read an example recently where a neurotypical partner was really frustrated that their partner didn't ever want to go to the movies in person, unrelated to COVID, just in general, never wanted to go to the movies, but rather really always insisted on waiting till something came out on Netflix or DVD or whatever. And it turns out that the autistic partner at the movie theater couldn't stand the noise of the candy wrappers or the smell of popcorn or the loud soundtracks. It was just overwhelming, and it was just unbearable. And so there was a good reason that they didn't want to go to the movies. It wasn't just being rigid or obstinate as the neurotypical partner might guess at. So in therapy, working with these couples, we really want to flesh out some of these differences and get clear about what's going on to help people find compromises, find workarounds, but also to really accept the other person and understand where they're coming from rather than tell themselves stories about it. So did I cover everything in that one? Let me just go back for a sec. Yes, okay. So another neurological divide can show up in, very often your couples will have tension between wanting variety versus wanting sameness. And this echoes some of the things that we've spoken about already here. If overhead of change, as we talked about with the autofocus versus the manual lens, if it's very effortful to make a change, it's going to be easier to stay on the same track. Anything for anyone, when something is more effortful and there are barriers, we're less likely to do it, right? It's harder to do. So staying the same is easier for many people. Again, for reasons that are not clear, autistic people tend to persist longer with topics or challenges or special interests longer than a neurotypical person does. We don't know why. But that's a pretty clear pattern that happens. And that can cause frustrations for both partners. That tenacity, that cognitive persistence or cognitive tenacity, that I like to call it, it's a great strength in fields like engineering, for example. And that's why one of the reasons why we see a lot of autistic people being phenomenal engineers, because the problem will be solved no matter how long it takes, right? There's that persistency rather than, giving up or losing interest. Another thing to think about with variety versus sameness is nervous system regulation. So if someone is very upregulated, if they've been overwhelmed by stimulation, if they've been, doing a lot of things, or if they're very activated, sameness might bring them back down to a more neutral level where they feel better, right? If they're highly activated, sameness might be able to bring us down. Whereas if someone is downregulated, let's say they're home or they're in the same place all the time and they're bored or they're tired, variation might upregulate them. So both are trying to move toward neutral and toward kind of this happy baseline, but coming from different places. And again, this is independent of neurology, but it often does track, whereas an autistic person might need downregulation and a neurotypical person might need upregulation. So we want to think about that as well when we're working with couples. So just a couple more slides and then I'll pause again for questions and comments. One way that I like to think of the challenges that mixed neurology couples face is by using a metaphor of a bridge. So if you imagine two people, they can be together, they can share feelings and experiences, but if they're on opposite sides of a bridge, they might need help crossing the bridge or meeting in the middle, or even building a bridge if there isn't a bridge there, or there might be barriers on the bridge that need to be worked through. So I think of this neurological divide as this bridge with people on the opposite sides of it, and we need to help them find some way to meet together. That's a metaphor that I just like and I like to think about. This picture is in Vietnam near Da Nang, and in English it's called the Golden Bridge. So I have two more TikToks for you. First is Corey, and he's going to demonstrate a common disconnect between mixed neurotype folks that exemplifies a few things: straightforwardness versus indirection, not reading nonverbals, and also I think neurotypical bias, because at the end he kind of mocks he's playing himself. He's playing both a neurotypical person and an autistic person, but you'll see that he kind of almost mocks himself a little bit as the autistic person. So here we go with this.
Why do some people lose hair and some don't? I don't know. Why is the sky blue? Because sunlight is made up of different colors and gases and particles, and there's the atmosphere scatters sunlight in different directions, and the blue light is scattered more because it travels in shorter, smaller waves.
So if you've worked with these couples, or if you've seen, or if you have friends that are autistic, or if you yourself are autistic, this might be kind of a familiar kind of interaction to you. So next is Isa, and Isa's going to be talking about why eye contact may be a different and a difficult experience for an autistic person, and different from the experience of a neurotypical one. Now, neurotypicals make a lot of meaning out of eye contact or lack thereof. We ascribe a lot of meaning to it. And we may or may not be right? Just like other stories that we tell ourselves, who knows? But I'm going to challenge you to see if you can really listen to what Isa is saying about the physical experience of eye contact and her preference for boundaries. see if you can really, with an open mind and an open heart, take in that what she's saying, take it at face value if you can. All right, let me play this one.
These are some reasons why eye contact is incredibly difficult for me as an autistic person. So first off, it feels incredibly intimate and invasive, especially if I don't know the person really well. Through eye contact, you can convey a lot of emotion and a lot of information, and it's just too much for me to take in, and I don't want other people to be able to read me like that. The discomfort that comes with making eye contact can translate into physical pain. I've heard other autistic people describe it as like a burning sensation. Me, it's more like intense discomfort. There are also a lot of rules to eye contact that I don't inherently know. So when I look at someone while I'm masking, I don't know necessarily when I'm supposed to look away. And then that creates a new form of anxiety on top of the already uncomfortable sensation of looking directly at someone.
So she's talking about both neurology and parts, right? So the parts come in at the end where she talks about not knowing the rules and being anxious about, I don't think she said anxious, but about, you know, feeling funny about it and not knowing the rules. Those are some parts. So we'll pause now for a few minutes of questions and comments. If there are any, let me stop sharing. Hey, Amanda.
So we do have some questions.
Okay.
Let's take a look here. So from Sarah, when using IFS with a neurodivergent client, do you see an easing of some of the communication issues as the parts of the clients begin to unburden? Simply
Yes.
put, does IFS help improve the behaviors commonly associated with autism? I don't want to use the term improve, but I do absolutely 100% see, and I do have another. You're reading my mind, everybody here. I do have another slide on this because when parts unblend in anybody, but in a neurodivergent person or an autistic person, they have more access to social awareness and social connection. Absolutely, 100%. And I just want to make clear that I didn't say this earlier. Sarah used improve in.
Oh, okay, yeah. Okay, gotcha. Yeah.
Okay, so what do we have next here? Would love to talk a bit about couples where both people are neurodivergent, but in different ways. For example, my autistic client is having tremendous conflict with his partner with ADHD, and they are in constant power struggle around whose support needs are more valid, etc.
Yeah. That's a toughie, and I would love to be able to address that here. But again, because of time constraints, I don't think that I can. But I do really hear your question, and you know, and I think that maybe the best way that I can answer that is if you look at Dick's book, You're the One That You Want, and Tony's book, Intimacy from the Inside Out. A lot of the strategies for, you know what, it sounds like a power struggle in that couple. And a lot of the strategies that Dick and Tony talk about are things that will generally address sort of the power struggle issue. It sounds like one saying, you know, my needs are more important, my needs are more important. And so if I'm understanding the question correctly, that would be a resource. It's not specific to neurodiversity, but it does address some of those power struggle issues. Yeah, I was gonna say, I was just trying to think if I had other resources on that to share. Off the top of my head, I can't think of any, but feel free to email me that question and I'll chew on it a little bit. But I know that I'm not going to specifically address that today.
Thank you. We have a question that is very specific to IFS here. Would you say, this is from Charlene, would you say self with a capital S in a person with a neurodivergent system is also neurodivergent, or just the parts in the system of neurodivergence?
Yeah, I think I understand. Can you say that again though, Amanda? I just want to make sure I got it.
Would you say self in a person with a neurodivergent system is also neurodivergent, or just the parts in the system of neurodivergence?
Yeah, another great question. I will freely admit that I don't know. But what I think about in terms of my hypothesis around that, I really like what Dick says about hardware and software. And as a former software engineer myself, I really like that analogy. I think computers are a great metaphor for the mind and the brain. But if we don't have the hardware, we can't always access self. It's, it's there, but we can't necessarily access it. I am not saying, I just want to be super clear, I'm not saying that autistic people don't have self. I'm not saying that. But what I am saying is that, what am I saying? Let me clarify myself here. I think that self transcends neurology, but I think that neurology is real and it's a filter through which self can manifest. So I'm not sure I'm answering the question here, but maybe you can re-ask it or refine it if I'm not addressing it. So I think that everyone has self and everyone has theoretical access to it, but sometimes hardware limits it. So again, I am not saying, in fact, I want to say the opposite. Autistic people have access to self, but they can have parts that make it harder to get there.
Okay.
I'm not sure if that feels like a good answer or not to folks.
It makes sense to me, though.
Okay.
I'm not the questioner. Okay, so Molly actually has this is similar to the same topic, and maybe it will help to flesh out this idea. I'm curious about how to distinguish ND traits, non-divergent traits, from parts. My partner says, quote unquote, I have met autistic parts. A couples therapist has suggested that it is all parts. And sometimes that feels like glossing over the atypical neurology. I realize we cannot really know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a really good issue that you both are bringing up, the last two questions. And there is so much more for us to learn about this. My theory is that that there's hardware and software. If I have a broken arm, I have a broken arm, and that arm's not going to work very well. So yeah, that's a bad thing for me to say, because I feel like when I say that, I'm implying that something is broken, and I don't mean to imply that. What I mean to say is that we all have physical bodies and we all have neurologies that shape how things come through. And then on top of that, we all have parts that also shape how things come through. And so, it is a great question. How do you tease them apart? And I will say that AANE, the Asperger Autism Network of New England, has some great trainings and some great resources. It's not an IFS-based program that they have. It's very just focused on neurology specifically, but they have some great ways to tell and to distinguish if something is neurological or not. So I would refer you to their website, and I can also share resources with people for sort of kind of teasing that apart. But it is a good question. What is parts or software? I would say. What is hardware or neurology? I would say it is hard to tell. I think that in addition, I think that somebody's asking this too, that I do think parts can have their own different neurological pathways. I mean, I know they have their own different neurological pathways. And so I have autistic parts for sure. I am a neurotypical person, but I have parts that can be, that can have very autistic qualities to them. For most, actually, mine comes more from trauma, honestly, but parts that look very autistic, that focus me in, that make me socially awkward sometimes and things like that. So I guess I'm saying I think it's a both and.
That's great. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want more, or would you like to keep going?
Let's do one more.
Okay. So I actually just have a comment from Louisa when we were talking about communication. I have twin 10-year-old boys on the spectrum, and one absolutely hates it when I speak in a very attuned, soft tone when he's upset. There's something about the caring tone where he experiences it as making him feel worse, quote unquote. He asks me, therefore, to essentially take my soft tone out of what I'm saying so he can hear the words and not feel worse by my soft tone. I just use this as an example of how we can learn from each autistic person about what helps them. So helping an autistic know that they need explicitly, what they need explicitly communicates some sort of these nuances, might go a long way.
I love that. That's such a great example. And yeah, and I think that's a really important point, that we want to really listen to people of any neurology, of any race, of any gender, and really take at face value what they're telling us. I don't like this. This makes me feel bad. You know, maybe this works for other people, but it doesn't work for me. So, you know, I love that you said that, and I think that's a really good point. And it also reminds me that in my work with couples, with mixed neurology couples, that I do run into, and I wonder if this is kind of a similar thing to what you're saying, Charlene, I think was it Louisa, sorry about that. Is that, you know, as a therapist, I try to validate a lot, and some of my autistic clients don't like it. They find it patronizing. And so instead of saying, you know, oh, that must have been hard, you know, that's kind of offensive to some people, you know, I'll say, you know, I go to a kind of a cognitive place, because there could be a cognitive match there. And I might say, oh, I understand, you know, and kind of, again, like not with that soft, caring tone, because that can feel patronizing to some people, but just like, I get it, you know. So maybe that's a similar thing. But yes, thank you for that comment. That's really great.
Thank you so much.
Great. Okay, so we're going to move on. So I'm going to actually show you the Sean. Let me just go ahead in my slides here. So we're going to do some work with our parts. So I'm going to actually show you the Sean and Carly slide again. And I'm hoping very much that it doesn't play an ad, but we'll find out. Play an external video. Oh, just bear with me for a moment. So what I'm going to ask you to do this time, if you will, is as you watch the video, once again, track your parts. It's exactly the same video as before. But as you watch it, notice if anything has shifted for you. Now that we've been talking about neurodiversity and some of the differences between neurologies and looking under the hood a little bit, see if anything has shifted, if you have different parts that come up, or if you have more or less compassion for one of the partners than you did before, or different kinds of experiences around that. And this time after the video, we will pause, and Amanda's going to help us host a little bit of sharing of parts. So after the video's over, I'll invite you to share parts into the chat if you're comfortable, whatever you're comfortable saying. If you'd rather not, if it's too personal, obviously don't. But if you're comfortable, share something about either the first time through or the second time through, what's different, what's the same, and then Amanda will help us share those. Okay, here we go. Okay, so let me give you a moment to jot down any ideas that you had, and then again, if whatever you might be comfortable sharing with the group, please feel free to type it into the chat, and Amanda's going to help us organize those.
And Kim, when I do share some of them, I'm only going to be on audio, because I've been reading in the chat that there's been some glitches with our video when both of us are on video. So I'm just going to stay on audio.
Okay, all right, thanks. So Amanda, are there things being shared in the chat now? We could get started if there are any.
Yeah, so just a couple are coming through. Oh, there we go. They're all popping up now. So Gail says, I definitely feel more tender towards the guy. Sarah says, I feel sadness for him because life will always be more challenging, but hopeful that he can find someone who understands him. Larry has a deep feeling for both persons and compassion for the apparent lack of a bridge between them. Charlene is saying, part of me in the beginning identified more with the NT partner, and during the second one, I felt parts of me having more understanding for the ND partner. I also saw more of the way the NT and ND partner were having a little disconnect and connection at the same time.
Great.
And then Molly says, first time I got in touch with my parts that feel impatient, like there's no room for me in my own relationship. Second time, though, I felt more self-energy. I remembered the camera metaphor and saw each person with that viewpoint.
Nice.
Kate says, I had access to empathy/compassion for both partners. Loved that she explained her need and he reached for her hand, wishing she acknowledged, validated. Oh, I lost it. Sorry. Wishing that she acknowledged/validated that might have been hard, as he had just said.
Right.
Yeah.
I can share a little bit of my own experience with that video the first time I watched it and then subsequent times. I remember early in the video when Sean says, it should be my way. And I immediately got, my feminist parts got activated because I'm like, he's interrupting her. He's telling her, you know, his way trumps hers. And, you know, I got very worked up about that. And I had a lot of compassion for her. I had compassion for both of them because I did see how much they were trying to connect and cross the bridge. And, you know, he really did try to do what she wanted after listening to her. But I felt, and in the initial watching, I felt kind of badly for her, even more so. I was a little more aligned with her because I was thinking, you know, she's never going to get that need met, right? Or that want met. The second time that I watched it, or later watchings of it, I started to really actually be more self-led. And I do think that the two of them had a fairly self-led conversation. Maybe there was a little bit of parts at the beginning, but they did a pretty good job, I think, of doing a self-led interaction there. Except I noticed that when the music started playing and Carly started explaining to Sean, you know, what the significance of handholding, I was thinking, wow, there's neurotypical bias, right? She's saying, this is what it means. And I'm thinking, that's what it means to her. Or maybe that's what it means to a lot of neurotypical people. But that's a worldview. It's not a universal. And that's one of the ways that I cue into like power and privilege. If somebody makes a global statement about the truth. And so she kind of does that. And so in my mind, I'm like, oh, she's like NT-splaining him, you know? And, you know, it wasn't really making, it was assuming a truth that as a universal, that's not necessarily a universal. So I got a little triggered by that. In later watchings of it, I didn't notice it right away. And in fact, I think that the soundtrack there was supporting that because it was kind of like this, like, oh, you know, kind of presentation of, you know, the divine truth is coming through. So that actually became a little triggering for me in subsequent watchings. I do also want to share, and I thought about including this in the presentation, but it didn't quite fit. That later on in that episode, they find a way to compromise, which is kind of mind-boggling. And they settle on this, I wish I could show you, but like if these are two people's hands, they settle on like doing this, where they're touching at the lower part of their arms and their hands are sort of gesturing toward each other, but not literally holding. I don't know if you can kind of make sense of the gesture that I'm doing here. But I thought that that was also such a lovely example of when two people can really listen to each other and really understand where each other is coming from, there might be a way to compromise. Something that at first seems hopeless or black and white maybe has more possibility than it might seem at first. So we have a little more time here. I don't know if there are any more comments in the chat or other things that people want to share.
Yeah, I'm just scrolling through here. So Jill says that I felt for him mostly. Oh. Sometimes it's hard to hold on to it as the chat moves.
Yeah.
I felt for him mostly the first time we watched, and for her more the second time around. Priscilla says, interesting hearing Kim's reaction about NT worldview as the truth. I didn't have that awareness, but it makes so much sense. And then another comment agreeing from Molly, Kim, your interpretation about bias is helpful to me. Seems like there's a lot of both and, along with some blind spots on the part of the storytellers.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah, second time around, a lot more awareness about both sides from Charlene. Jacqueline felt parts protective and frustrated with both parties.
Mm-hmm.
The first time I watched the video clip, I was aware of parts that felt sad and hopeless for Sean and Carly. On second watching, I observed courage and hopefulness in my system. That was from Priscilla.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay. So Amanda, does that kind of capture a lot of it? Should we move on, do you think, or is there much more to share?
Yeah, I think that captures it. Just one last comment that's kind of more of a question from Molly. I'm curious about how our managers enter into these relationships.
Very strongly. I think that this clip was a nice example of a fairly self-led interaction. That's not what you usually see, right? There's a lot of very angry and wounded. There's a lot of very wounded parts and a lot of very angry managers that show up in these couples. I don't know if there's a more specific point that I'm not answering here, but a lot of times, for example, we'll see judgment. Carly might say, I'm making this up, obviously it didn't happen in the show, but Carly might say to Sean, something to the effect of, what's your problem? Or, what's the big deal? Or, you're weird or something like that. Sean probably is feeling bad. He knows that she wants that. He probably ascribes to that worldview of that's the normal thing to do, and he just can't do it. So he's probably got a polarization between his own needs and wanting to meet the needs of his partner. And he may or may not express that to her. A therapist would have to help kind of draw that out about probable polarizations that are going on under there. A common manager for autistic people, in my experience, is kind of one that goes quiet, that doesn't say anything, even though there's a lot going on inside, because again, it's been dangerous for them in their lives to articulate things because they'll be shamed or misunderstood. So I very often see like something that shuts down attempts at verbalizing things. Does that answer that?
Yeah, so Molly, if you just want to say in the chat if you feel satisfied with that answer, and then maybe we can keep going.
Amanda, that audio was breaking up. I could.
Oh. So, okay, can you hear me?
Now I can hear you. Yeah.
Wonderful. So I don't see a response to your answer in the chat. Just a few people kind of commenting on your response and agreeing. So I'm not sure. Oh, okay. So Molly says that I meant the partner in a coupleship. But yes, that's good to know for now. Thank you.
Okay. Okay.
Great.
All right. So so let's move on. Okay. So so now we're going to pull this all together. How do we work with couples and help them using IFS and IFIO? So here are some of the characteristics of IFIO. And again, that stands for intimacy from the inside out. And it's a couples modality based on IFS. IFIO is experiential and process-oriented. Obviously, when we're working with couples, we have 2 clients. And Tony Herbine-Blank says, we're never going to ask one partner to change so that the other can stay the same. So we have 2 clients in the room, and we're going to have both of them do the work. And this is especially something to pay attention to in neurodiverse couples, because as I mentioned earlier, there's often assumptions that the autistic partner can't change or doesn't get it or won't get it or can't get it or can't do anything differently. And that's just not true. But based on that assumption, therapists often over-rely on the neurotypical partner to do most of the work, to be the manager, to do more of the mental load. And so it's really important to make sure that we're balancing that out. And that doesn't mean that both partners are going to do the same work at the same rate or at the same time, each as they're able, but that we're not over relying on one or enabling the other to avoid, participating in that. In IFIO and in IFS, we know that secure internal attachment leads to healthier external attachment, and that unblending, which is affect regulating, leads to the potential for deeper connection with others. And Stephen Porges has actually done some research on using polyvagal specifically with autistic individuals. And this harkens back to a comment that somebody made earlier. Porges's research supports the hypothesis that with nervous system regulation, there is improved social connection in the autistic population. So I've read a little bit of that research. I don't know if there's a paper. I haven't read the whole thing, but it's pretty compelling, and it does align with what I see in couples. It's even more important in mixed neurology couples for the environment to be really safe and for people to be really unblended, both partners. And so I'll say a little bit more about that. Activated extreme parts block access to self, hindering our abilities in the moment. They narrow our bandwidth. They limit our options. This is kind of the software and the hardware thing again. So anything that we struggle with organically is doubly difficult when parts are activated. So for me, I have one of my neurodivergencies is in retaining visual information. I just can't, for whatever reason. I'm very bad at that. I always have been. I can tell you some stories, but you don't want to hear those. If I'm asked to remember a section of a map, for example, I can't do it very well. But if I'm really calm and I really concentrate, I can do it a little bit. But it's effortful, very effortful for me. If I have anxious parts up or angry parts up, and I'm asked to do that, it's virtually impossible. So the parts further impair whatever challenges we have organically, right? So as part of the definition of autism spectrum disorder, there's trouble attending to social information, and there's trouble with social and relational engagement. So if that's a bit of a hardware issue, and then we add onto it parts, and we also add onto it the pressure that we're asking an autistic person to inherently in their relationship do something that they're not good at, it's a big ask, right? So all the more reason why we need to have the environment really safe. So, and oftentimes you'll find, and this is maybe sort of a response to the how do the managers show up question, that oftentimes it's the neurotypical partner who's more activated and more angry and more partsy. and might need more help working with their parts and connecting with their parts in order to make the space safe enough for the autistic partner to lower their defenses and relax their parts, and for that social engagement to emerge. And one way I like to think about this is I am also being like not great visually. I'm artistically, I'm musical, but I'm not visually artistic at all. And so if my relationship depended on me being able to make art, I would be in trouble. I would be in trouble. So that helps me bring compassion to people that are struggling with these relational issues when they're being asked fundamentally to be in a relationship and to do it well in order for their partner to be happy. That's right there, kind of a dilemma, right? Okay. So here are some considerations to keep in mind when working with neurodiversity, and in particular with autism or autistic profiles. We probably want to provide explicit psychoeducation about empathy and perspective. So debunking the myth that empathy doesn't exist in an autistic person or is impaired. We really want to focus on that, building that bridge and the cognitive empathy piece. And perspective. Many of my couples, neurotypical and otherwise, struggle with sort of believing their partner's perspective or treating it as valid, but this can be especially hard for someone on the spectrum. And they may need, the couple may need extra instruction about perspective taking. So I'm going to show you this other slide. And this comes from AANE and Grace Myhill, who's the director of the Neurodiverse Couples Institute there. And she offers these graphics. You're probably familiar with these if you look at them from different perspectives, you see different things. This is a really great teaching tool for showing that different perspectives are in fact valid, whether we know it or not. And I believe as an IFS therapist and a humanist that nothing is irrational if we have enough context. We can't always have enough context. We don't always understand all the context or consider all the factors that are playing into something. But if we could, we would understand why the other person is behaving the way that whatever way that they're behaving, or why their perspective is in fact valid. So, excuse me, so we might need to do some explicit teaching of clients, to clients around this issue. If we don't give our partner the benefit of the doubt in that they're in knowing and assuming that their perspective is valid, then we are conveying the message that our way is the only right way, or that we know better than they do, or that we don't believe them. And none of those are happy messages in a couple, right? So we want to really make sure that we're helping the partners, both partners, to take the other person's perspective as valid. So providing psychoeducation about both empathy and perspective, or, valid perspectives. We want to try to undo some of the bias and the neurotypical bias and the marginalization. So we want to help the couple shift the paradigm from wrong or broken to different. They're different from each other. We want to translate between the two partners and help them build a bridge until they can do it for themselves. So we want to be helping them build a bridge, but we also want to be teaching them to do it for themselves, obviously. And then finally, I find that in autistic people, thinking parts are very, very often gatekeepers. So it's necessary to obtain buy-in in order for the therapy to progress. So we want to honor and respect thinking parts and not get into a power struggle with them. We want to work with them. And another way that I think about this is if I imagine someone who has maybe trouble regulating their sensory input, or who might have difficulty reading their own internal state or their own intuition, they're going to rely heavily on their cognition. It serves them well. It probably works really well. And so that's going to be their go-to. And so honoring that when you're working with neurodiverse couples, and I will say more about that in a little while. So I'm going to skip that slide. So using IFIO in mixed neurotype relationships, with those thinking parts, we might need to use direct access. And in fact, you probably will need to use direct access at first. And keep in mind that a lot of great work can be done with direct access. We don't only have to work with parts in an unblended way. We can do just about everything with using direct access. It's just a little bit, it requires a little bit of thinking and a little bit of a shift in terms of how you implement IFS and IFIO. For some people are very good at it. But don't shy away from doing that if you need to. It can really help. You want to address alexithymia challenges with using different modes of communication and by slowing down. So what I mean by that is different modes of communication might be offering, music or images, not just kind of, what words come to mind or what are your feelings about that? We might say, does this remind you of a piece of music, or can you draw that for me, or something like that? And also by slowing things way down, checking our assumptions or what we're assuming is a given that another person might not be assuming. So if I'm going to ask somebody to tell me how they're reacting to something, and I'll show this to you in an example in a minute, we might need to break things down into component steps, just to be very clear and precise and specific with what we're asking another person to do. In IFS and IFIO, we try not to be leading, and so we don't like to, we usually like to try open-ended questions first. But you may find that especially an autistic person might struggle with those open-ended questions. They might not know what Zoom level you're at, so they might not know. I'll give you a quick example, and this is bad on me for sure. I have a client who's autistic, and he always is in his room when we have our sessions, so I'm very familiar with, the background and what his room looks like, and we've been working together for a while. And then recently we had a session, and he was traveling, and I didn't know he was traveling, so he connected from a hotel room that he was staying in, and I kind of was taken aback, and I said, "Oh, where are you at right now?" And he said, "Well, I'm feeling okay," and he was answering my question, but he was thinking about where he was at emotionally, which is something that I would normally ask him, but I meant literally, where are you at physically? And I had to clarify that. So that's an example of how if something is too open-ended, there's a lot of potential for misinterpretation. And as I said earlier, autistic people sometimes have a protector that prevents them from speaking or taking guesses. Again, they may have been, shamed for doing that and getting it wrong. So if I try a few times with an open-ended question and it's not working, then I will switch to a menu of choices. And that also helps sort of prime the person to access vocabulary as well around that. And then remember that we always want to help our couples move from content to process. That's really what's going to help them. Again, the laundry doesn't matter, but the power struggle does matter. And note that that might take longer in mixed neurology couples. I have actually also seen it take a shorter amount of time. But typically it might take longer for both people to get on the same page and for both people to be able to recognize the process, both in theory in the office, but also in practice when it's happening. So be patient with that. So now I have a little example of a transcript, and I'll just kind of read it to you and read the commentary. So on the right are my comments about what's happening. I've highlighted sort of what I think are key things. And I've put in italics the things that might be a little bit different for working with an autistic person or a neurodivergent person or a mixed neurology couple than they would be with a neurotypical couple. So in this example, Jack and Ethan are a couple, are married, and Jack is autistic and Ethan is not. And so this is in the middle of a protocol in IFIO we call tracking sequences, where we stay with one partner for a little while and we find out a little bit about their protective system. And if we're lucky, we get a little bit of information about their exiles or their vulnerabilities. And then we ask sort of behaviorally, how does the protector do its thing? Then we cross over to the other partner. How does that behavior land on you? What happens for you? And then we do the same thing with that partner. We hear about the protector. We try to get a little bit of information about the underlying vulnerability if we can. And then we cycle back and we continue on in that way. So this is in the middle of that protocol. And I'm turning to Jack, who's a partner on the spectrum. And I say, so Jack, when Ethan said that, in addition to making a note to pick up more diapers, what did you notice happening inside yourself? So that's a U-turn question for Jack. I'm asking him to notice what happens inside himself. And he says, I don't know what you mean. And so then I use one of the 6 Fs, the find. Did you notice anything in your body? Another U-turn question. And he says, I don't think so. I don't remember. So now I'm gonna coach him. I'm gonna break it down. I'm gonna be very specific. I'm not gonna give up. And so I say, Jack, can you pretend it's happening right now? Can you simulate it? And I find that again, computer concepts are really helpful in working with autistic individuals because many of them are familiar with computers. Many people are nowadays. And computer concepts are tangible and unambiguous. So I will say sometimes something like, can you simulate it? And Jack agrees. And then I say, see if you can hear what Ethan sounds like or see how he looks when he says that to you. And now I'm breaking it down. So the first part is hold it in your mind. And then I'm going to ask him to check what's happening for him. And I'm going to do that by suggesting a body scan. While you hold that scenario in mind, scan your body for sensations. And I'm going to spell it out because he might not know what a body scan is. Many people don't. Check your head, your face, check your neck and shoulders, your arms, your hands, your chest, your gut, your backs, hips, legs, and feet. And what do you notice in your body right now? So I'm being very precise with my language. I'm, like I said, breaking it down into components. And notice that I didn't ask him about his heart. With a neurotypical person, I might, and it wouldn't have been a bad thing to do here either. But that's a little bit more of a something that we're not as familiar with kind of checking. It's a little bit more ambiguous. I can't think of the word that I'm trying to say. It's less tangible to us. We usually know what our hands feel like, let's say, but we might not know what our heart feels like. So I left it out because my guess is that if I had included it, it might have derailed the protocol a little bit. It might have gotten him off track. He would say, I don't know what my heart feels like. What are you talking about? So again, it wouldn't be wrong to say it. It might work fine, but it might derail it a little bit. So I just kind of left it out here and stuck, and for the most part, stuck with the sort of really obvious parts of the body. And so then Jack's able to say, yeah, I guess my stomach is churning a little bit. And then I'm going to use different modes of communication. Are there any words or sounds or images that go along with that churning stomach? And he says, yeah, I should just keep quiet and it'll pass. So notice he's naming a protector and its hope. I should keep quiet, right? And I'm guessing that his exile, he doesn't say it, but I'm guessing there might be an exile under there if I'm going to get it wrong. And his hope is that the moment will pass or the tension will pass. And there might be deeper hopes under there, but we're not going to worry about that right now. So then I say, okay, I see. And are you aware of any emotions? And I'm starting with an open-ended question. And he answers it. He's aware of Ethan's emotion. He says, Ethan's angry, but he's fishing around for something from me and I'm going to get it wrong. So he hasn't named his own emotion, but he did answer my question. I was asking about his own emotion, but I didn't make that explicit. So he answered me perfectly well. And interestingly, his answer shows that he's well aware that Ethan's angry. Ethan might think maybe from Jack's affect or from lack of answering that Jack's oblivious or Jack doesn't care. But you see, that's not true. Jack is well aware that Ethan's angry, and he's well aware that there's some expectation from him, but he doesn't know what it was. So I'm going to try a U-turn again, and I'm going to say, and how about for you? What emotions do you notice in yourself? And again, I'm trying open-ended again, and he says, I don't know. So now I'm going to give him a menu, and I'm going to say anything like maybe anxiety or fear or confusion. And honestly, I'm just guessing. You know, if I get it wrong, that's fine, but I'm still sort of setting the expectation of what kind of thing I'm asking him about. And he's able to say, yes, I guess some anxiety about getting into a fight. And then he offers up more information that I wasn't even anticipating. And he says, and I'm annoyed that he's not saying what he means. So there's one of his parts, right? I'm annoyed that Ethan's being so vague. So there's a protector fear that he named, plus he's naming a new part there. Okay. Just a couple more slides and then we'll pause again for questions. So how do we build the bridge? Well, we want to encourage the couple to really quantify and operationalize their ideas in order to negotiate wants and needs. So, you know, a partner might say, I want more emotional support. Well, what does that mean? That could mean a million things to a million people, right? And we do this with our neurotypical couples too. But we may need to do it to a deeper degree of precision and specification with autistic individuals, and especially with across, you know, for building that bridge across the neurological divide. We want to get as much detail as is necessary for both partners to really get it. I had a client say once to me, if I can code it, I can do it. And I loved that. You know, it really helped me kind of understand, an ultimate goal, if we can make it that straightforward and zero in on the key qualities, then the other partner is going to be likely to be able to understand it. Whether or not they agree to do it is a different story. That's the negotiation. We want to help partners learn to recognize and articulate their own dilemmas and build awareness of their own assumptions. And again, this is something we do for all our clients, right? What happens in your body when you get upset like that? What do you notice? So we want to help them be able to key in, not just in the therapy session, but in their lives as well, on when they're getting activated. And also we want to especially encourage and work with parts for an autistic person that might have been shut down in articulating these things because they might have been shamed. And we will probably also need to work with the neurotypical partner to honor the try, and try not to punish intentionally or otherwise getting it wrong, or something that they didn't expect or something that they judge as weird. So we want to really work with both partners to make it safe for them to do this with each other. And we also want to help folks build awareness of their own assumptions, and that's challenging. I think it's challenging for everybody. I know it's challenging for me, but that's also something that we work toward, because the more that we can make those explicit, again, the more that we understand ourselves and our parts, but then also the more we can connect, the more we're crossing that bridge. Mixed neurotype couples often need explicit facilitation of them negotiating their communication patterns and cadence. So a common neurotypical assumption would be one of reciprocity. So if I ask you how your day was, I want to hear and I really care, but then I might have an expectation that you're going to ask me too. And that's an assumption I'm making, an assumption about reciprocity or an expectation. And again, as we know, people don't share the same assumptions, and especially across that neurological divide. So if I want that from you, then, maybe I'll name that and we'll agree on it or not agree on it, but then it's more likely to happen, right? Same with greetings. I would really like us to kiss hello and goodbye. So again, we're just kind of making these things explicit and helping the couple to negotiate what will work for them and what won't, or to find commonalities or compromises. You can offer the camera metaphor to help facilitate mutual understanding and de-pathologizing. And then almost all of the literature you'll find, the existing literature on working with neurodiverse couples, is the behavioral, the problem solving, the coaching, and offering tools. So there are tons of those available. I showed you one with the duck bunny graphic, but if you look in the resources section or look at any other books on working with neurodiverse couples, you'll find those. So here's one final example, and this is really an example about, well, I'll save that for after. Actually, let me just read it to you first. So this is Dimitri and Lisa, and Dimitri is autistic and Lisa is not. And they're trying to negotiate a pattern for Lisa that's been hurtful in the past. And Lisa says, "It really hurts my feelings when I stub my toe or something, and you don't ask if I'm okay. I've asked you so many times to do that, and you never do." And Dimitri says, "You're not going to get seriously hurt by stubbing your toe. It's pointless for me to ask that." And Lisa says, "It's rude not to say anything." She's talking about a worldview here, right? Here's the neurotypical bias. I know the truth, and the truth is that it's rude not to say anything when someone gets a little hurt. Do you even notice when something like that happens? So again, she's kind of telegraphing a little bit of one of her parts that believes that he's oblivious. And then he says, "I have seen it happen." And she says, "Well, why don't you ask me about it then?" And he says, "If you needed help, I'm pretty sure you'd tell me," which is probably true, right? Like if she got really hurt and he wasn't responding, just like with any partner, you're going to say, "Help me." But that makes Lisa angry, because for her, it's not about needing help. It's about something else that we really haven't named yet, or not named enough that Dimitri gets it. So because Lisa now is getting angry and getting activated, I'm going to work with her to unblend and speak for her parts, because we know that with the blending, neither partner is going to get anything out of it, and it might cause more problems. So, we really can't do any work if Lisa's blended. So not to shame her at all, but to just work with her to help her unblend so that she can speak for her parts and be more, and clearly advocate for what it is that she's asking about and what she needs. So that takes as long as it takes. And then after that, Lisa's able to say, "I would like you to ask me if I'm okay, like if I stub my toe or something." And Dimitri says, "I really don't see the point. And Lisa says, the point is that it shows you care about me. And Dimitri says, of course I care about you. And Lisa says, yes, but it's nice to have little reminders of it. I would really like you to do this for me. And Dimitri says, I still don't see the point, but I can try. So there's the buy-in that we're looking for, okay? Before that, you know, one or the other partners might have assumed, yeah, we'll do this. Okay, I get it. But we don't really have explicit buy-in. But once we have the explicit buy-in, now we have something that we can hook onto and try to facilitate. So, you know, this is obviously not complete. The couple might need still some help with implementing this. They might, Dimitri might need help with strategies for getting into this habit. And, you know, because for anybody, any new habit takes a while to establish. It's not overnight. It's not instantaneous. Just because we know something doesn't mean we then do it immediately. And Lisa might need help, might need help honoring the try. And, you know, we might need to work with her if she gets triggered, if, you know, Dimitri misses it a couple of times or he doesn't do it right away. We want to help Lisa see the overall arc of what we're working toward, and that it takes a little while. So one of the bigger problems that is in this that you might not recognize, but this is very particular to neurodiverse couples, is that Lisa's request is actually still vague. So it could be, depending on Dimitri and how well they understand each other, it could be that when Lisa stubs her toe, Dimitri will say, are you okay? But if she walks into a door, that's not stubbing your toe. He might not know to say that. So if you were programming a computer to ask Lisa if she was okay, if she had a minor incident, how would you do it? How would you operationalize that? It's kind of hard, right? I don't know that I could do it. What are we really talking about? If she bumps into a door, if she falls down, if she cuts herself, if she gets tickled by a feather, how's Dimitri really going to know what Lisa wants? So, like I said, you know, he might not need that level of detail. He might be just fine with this. But that's something to notice, that the request from Lisa, it's specific for one case, but it's not really covering all the cases that she probably wants it to cover. So we might need to do more work fleshing that out. And that's an example of how with a mixed neurology couple, we might need to go a step further than we would with neurotypical couples or with people who share neurologies. So here are some top takeaways. You might want to explicitly teach about the validity of different perspectives. Trust the model, trust yourselves, and trust neurodivergent individuals that they can do a U-turn. And continue working with your own parts, including those with assumptions or biases around autism or other forms of neurodiversity. So I'm just going to breeze through these references and resources. They're in the handouts. You should be able to have access to them. And we're going to take, I guess we have about 10 or 12 more minutes for questions and comments. And I'll leave this up while we talk, at least for a little while, so that if you want to jot that down or screenshot it or something, you can get my contact information if you want to reach out to me. So, okay. So Amanda, is there material in the chat for us to process?
Hi. Yeah. So there's a few questions in the Q&A. I'll start with Jacqueline's because it's directly related to the Dimitri and Lisa example.
Okay.
So for Dimitri and Lisa, will it ever feel enough for each other's systems when they realize that the other is doing things for the other that they don't really understand?
So let me see if I understand that question. So is it good enough if I'm doing something but my heart's not in it? So like if Dimitri is asking her if she's okay, even though he doesn't really get why she wants him to ask that, is that going to feel fulfilling to Lisa? That's my understanding of the question. Yeah. And so, I mean, of course I don't know, but I want to say yes and no. So two components of that. I'm trying to pin things in my brain because when I start talking about one thing, then I forget the other thing that I wanted to say because I'm old. But anyway, so at first probably not. And we see this in neurotypical couples as well, though. You know, we see that you know, if I have to ask my partner for a hug, it doesn't feel as good if they knew that I wanted a hug, but people have to kind of get used to that because we can't read each other's minds. So in that sense, it's similar to what neurotypical couples will experience. That being said, the pin worked this time. I do remember the other part of that. That being said, probably as Dimitri gets in the habit of doing that, he's going to see the response that Lisa has. He's going to get in the flow of it, and he probably is going to get it after a while. And in fact, he might want it back. So, for himself. So, so that's why I say yes and no. At first, it might feel contrived or might feel insincere. But if they stick with it, if they trust each other, it can evolve into something that feels more thorough, maybe, for lack of a better word.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from Matthew. Kim, I'm interested in your experience both in naming when there is unacknowledged neurodivergence, as well as working with elements of trauma, which I've found is very common with people on the spectrum.
Right, yeah, good question. So the first part, can you say the first part of that again, Amanda? When it's unnamed but suspected. Yeah, that's a great question. Most things that I've ever read and most of the books and recommendations that you'll read say that a diagnosis helps. It helps most people. So, I keep that in mind when I'm working with my clients. And if someone really has sort of pronounced characteristics of autism spectrum disorder or another form of neurodivergency, I might ask them about it. I might say, have you ever heard this before? Does this sound familiar to you? Or here's my understanding of that, and here's what I'm seeing. What do you think? Am I getting it right? Or, and feel them out a little bit. If they're not wanting to go there, of course I wouldn't go there. If they're interested, we might talk about it a little bit more. I might, encourage them to get a diagnosis if I think it'll help. But as an IFS therapist, I'm actually not so interested in diagnoses. I might hold in my mind that there's a neurodivergency here, or I might say, I think the two of you are neurologically kind of different from each other, and I think that that's underlying some of the issues that you're seeing, and here's how I work with those, and here's what I know about this pattern and that pattern. But, I don't personally feel the necessity of someone getting diagnosed, for that reason. So, nothing that I'm saying is an absolute. And I think for some couples, the diagnosis can make things worse. It can arm a neurotypical partner against an autistic partner and sort of reinforce this issue that something's wrong with you or you're broken. And that's, rooted in the medical model and the diagnosis and the pathologizing of it. So I'm giving you a complicated answer. I say that the conventional wisdom is yes, name it and seek diagnosis. But in my experience, I try to work with that without pathologizing it or without naming it as, you're on the spectrum.
Great, thank you. I have a question from Jacqueline. I have a young woman client who sometimes presents as on the spectrum and other times more purely CPTSD, not usually considered part of the spectrum.
Oh, yes, I didn't address the trauma piece of the last one. Go ahead, sorry. Yeah.
She has a pattern of making hard, fast bonds to neurodiverse individuals who also happen to be harmful and sometimes violent. Can you speak to this mix in an individual and unhealthy patterns of partnering?
Yeah, some of the words I didn't catch there, Amanda, but I think I got the gist of it. And I think thank you for bringing this question. It's a really important question. And I realize I didn't answer part 2 of the last one around trauma. So definitely, and I think I'm a living example of this, and I've done a lot of work on myself, and I feel like I'm doing a lot better than I used to be. But trauma, parts that develop as a result of trauma can look like autism for sure. And there can be overlap in there. And many people who have autism have experienced a lot of trauma, bullying, hate crimes, marginalization, oppression, all kinds of stuff, right? And so for sure, that's common. And I think that, I don't know if this is going to be a very satisfactory answer or not, but I work with that the way that I work with any trauma is through parts work, starting with the protective system. And it might be slow going because the more trauma someone has, the more extreme their protective system is going to be. And, the longer it might take to really help them understand that, get in touch with it, heal it, or get below the protective system to the exiles. It takes time. And the deeper and more complex the trauma is, maybe the longer that's going to take. But what I would say is that if you're trying to work with someone who has a lot of trauma and you suspect they might be on the spectrum, then you might need to approach it initially from a more direct access place, or you might need to, again, like change up the modalities or some of the other strategies that I mentioned earlier. But the concept of the work that you're doing is the same. We want to help people understand their parts, not just from a cognitive place, but connect with their parts as best they can, help heal their parts, get buy-in from the protective system to go deeper. And then with individual couples, we really want to do that exile work. In couples, sometimes we do exile work, but also we're really working for the relationship. So we're working a lot of times with the protective system. But yes, they do often co-occur and they can mimic each other, and it's tricky. And one of the things that I love most about IFS and IFIO is that they're pretty self-correcting models. And so if we get it wrong, if we guess wrong, or we try something and it doesn't work, the client's going to let us know. And because we're not the expert, we're not imposing our method or our thoughts about how it's supposed to go on them. We're listening to them. And if I'm trying something and I'm getting pushback or it's not working, they're going to let me know, and then I'm going to try something else.
Okay, great. We have about 3 minutes left. So how would you like to wrap up, or one more question? Up to you.
Let's see. Are there any that feel kind of short? A short answer question in there?
That's hard for me to assess.
Right.
I guess there's a question from Linda. Linda's saying this may well be a pessimistic grieving part speaking, but do some of the mixed couples you work with actually end up being able to connect deeply in a way that is satisfying for both?
Yes. There's still going to be, I have definitely had that happen. It can take a long time depending on how much distress they're in. It's not a quick thing necessarily. And it also, it's never going to be the same experience that neurotypical couples have. It's just not going to be the same, but that doesn't mean that it's not going to be good enough to feel good. And so many neurotypical partners in a neurodiverse marriage will get some of their needs met. And this is true of neurotypical couples too, fully neurotypical couples. If I love classical music and my partner loves jazz, and my partner once in a while goes to a classical music concert with me, but not often, maybe I'm going to have other friends that I do that with. Or maybe I have a really huggy friend that I hang out with a lot because my autistic partner doesn't like to hug. So, there are some needs that we get met outside of the relationships. And polyamory actually is an interesting new addition to this. I do have a mixed neurotype couple that I'm working with that's introduced polyamory into their relationship to meet some of these needs, and they're both okay with that. If they weren't both okay with it, it wouldn't be okay. So there are things like that. But I do want to say that there are some real advantages in mixed neurotype couples that can show up. So for example, in neurotypical couples, very often one partner will be always trying to problem solve rather than letting the other one vent. And in mixed neurotype couples, sometimes I see that whole issue as being absent. If the autistic partner has been burned and has parts that don't want them to offer suggestions or don't want to make guesses, or don't make assumptions, that can be a really nice thing. The person can just be a good listener and not try to say, well, then you should do this, that, or the other thing. So some of the problems that commonly show up in neurotypical couples are actually absent in mixed neurology couples. So, so again, yes and no. Yes with variation, I guess, is the answer to that. So I think we'll end there. I think we're out of time. Thank you all so much for being here. I really appreciate it. And please feel free, like I said, to email me with feedback, comments, questions. I'd love to hear your thoughts, and I'll do my best to answer everything that I can, or at least give you some references to look at if I can't answer. Take this down.